Well, hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video we'll be talking about camera settings because it has been a while since I've made one of these videos and it's time for an update because a few things have changed. I will be walking you through my entire camera setup process, the settings for exposure, focusing and a few other bits and bobs. Now, settings can be quite specific to cameras and brands, however this video is very holistic in the sense that everything I'm going to share applies to every single brand. One thing I want to mention is there isn't such a thing as the correct set of settings or the best settings because best is very subjective. What's best for me might not work for you. So the healthiest approach to this video is to watch it, pick what works, pick what makes sense, throw away the rest, and over time you will build up your own, let's just say, set of settings based off what other people use, what you use, and it kind of all mashes into something that works for you. It's also worth noting that camera settings depend on what you're doing with the camera. So if you're a wedding photographer, your approach might be different compared to a landscape photographer. Now, if you're watching this, chances are you've seen one or two of my videos before, but if it's your first time here, most of my photography revolves around travel and street. Therefore, the settings that I share are aimed at those genres. So if you're taking aerial wedding photos in space, then I'm not sure this would be of any use to you. I don't think anyway. Let's start with the basics, and the first one is shooting RAW. I personally always shoot RAW. I do not shoot JPEGs. I've played around with JPEGs on various cameras now and again, but I can never get the results that I want. And for me, photography is just as much about editing and crafting your image afterwards as it is about being out there and shooting. So for me, RAW is the only option that I go for. Now, there is one thing I want to add to this, and that is that even if you're shooting exclusively in RAW, make sure that all your JPEG settings are either set to the default or switched off. So a good example that catches people out is the dynamic range setting that you get on cameras. So on Fuji it's called DR 100 or 200 or something, on Sony it's something else, but basically every camera has this dynamic range setting, and what it does is as you go up in that setting, the base ISO goes up as well, and on some cameras that actually impacts the RAW files as well. So I suggest having everything switched off, noise reduction, sharpening, just all of these features off. You want the most kind of basic, raw, untouched file out of the camera as possible so that you have the best starting point for your edit when you're in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever. The second thing that I do is shut the camera up and turn off any lights. So tally lights, focus lights, self-timer lights, all of that gets switched off. In terms of the sound, the camera is muted, there is no shutter sound, there's no focus sound, there's no switching on sound, there's no adjusting the menu sound, because I don't want the camera making any noise or emitting any lights because I don't want to disturb any subject that I'm shooting and I don't want to attract unwanted attention to myself. The last thing that I do is enable performance mode and increase any auto power off features that the camera has. So if by default the camera switches off after 2 minutes, I set it to 20 minutes. If the screen switches off after, I don't know, 30 seconds, I set it to 10 minutes. Basically, I want the camera to be on for as long as possible until I manually switch it off. Because the last thing I want is for the camera to switch off or for the screen to switch off. I'd rather just bring an extra battery. Now let's talk about custom buttons, and of course this really depends on the camera because some have many, some have none, but through the years of trying different cameras I found that almost all of them, if not all of them, have these buttons, and these are the ones that I program on every single camera regardless of the type or the brand. The first one is AEL, Auto Exposure Lock, and when you press it, or if you can press it once as a toggle or hold it, it doesn't matter, it locks the exposure. So this just allows you to expose and recompose. So you can expose on a brighter part of the scene, recompose to a darker part of the scene, and get a particular look. The same goes for AFL, which is autofocus lock. Same principle, same idea, sorry, but for focusing. So I would usually use this in conjunction with autofocus continuous, which tracks any changes. So I would focus. If I want it locked, I will hit AFL. On some cameras, you can combine AEL with AFL, which is nice. And it's locked, meaning that if people walk into my scene, if something happens, then I am not going to lose focus, or the camera is not going to try and refocus and mess the image up. Another custom button will always be assigned to toggle between different focus modes, specifically a small single point and a larger zone type of focus point. So different cameras call it different things. Fuji calls it zone. I think Sony calls it flexi spot. I can't remember now. Basically, it's a large box with a bunch of smaller boxes. We'll cover focusing in more detail later. But basically, I have a button which toggles between the two because I change it depending on what I'm shooting. If I'm shooting something specific, I'll have it as a single focus point. If I'm shooting something more broad or there's a lot going on, I'll use a bigger point. But yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Just a very quick interruption for me. If you're finding this video useful and the settings I'm sharing are helpful and make sense, then one of the best ways to support the channel and support my work is to purchase one of my camera guides. I make a camera guide for every camera that I personally own and use for at least 6 months. The guides I make are for Fuji cameras, there's a bunch there, Ricoh, Leica and Sony guides are coming soon. There's even an iPhone guide. So if you want to support the channel, I've linked the guides in the description. Please do check them out. Thank you. Now let's talk about exposure modes, and there are 4, of which I use 3. The first one is Aperture Priority. I use that most of the time. It's my go-to exposure mode because the aperture controls so much in the frame. You know, if I shoot something at f1.4, I then shoot it at f11, even though it's the same scene, the same camera, the same lens, you get 2 very different images that can tell 2 very different stories. So having that control for me is important. There is shutter priority mode, which is what I actually use quite a lot these days. And shutter priority I use for 3 reasons. The first one is if I want to get creative with slow shutter speeds and create motion blur in my images. If I want to freeze motion, so there's a specific motion that I want frozen. And the third reason is actually the newest reason is I shoot in low light, I shoot at night in a shutter priority now. The third mode is auto or program. I don't really use it that much. However, now and again, if I'm out with my family or friends and I just can't be bothered to think about photography, I have the camera on me just in case. I'll just leave it in auto because then I'm just, spray, pray, point and shoot. I'm not invested in the photography. That's when I'll leave it in auto. Last but not least, we have manual. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the last time I shot in full manual exposure. It's been a very long time. Some people shoot in manual because they love the control aspect of it, because they feel more involved in the process, which I totally understand. Other people shoot manual because, let's say if you're shooting a landscape, there's nothing moving, you're on a tripod, it makes sense to shoot in manual because you're just in control of every parameter of that camera. Same if you're shooting architecture, for instance, right? So in those cases, manual makes sense. For me though, it's just not something that I use. Now let's talk about exposure values and metering. So I use multi-metering most of the time. This is where the camera looks at the scene and gives you an overall balanced exposure. I find that for a vast majority of my photography, that is more than enough, and then I can just adjust the exposure using the compensation dial if I need to. However, if I am shooting through a window, if I'm shooting out of a car, out of my room, for example, or if I'm shooting through something, then I will use the center weighted metering mode because that ignores everything around the edges and just focuses in the middle, and that can help you with incorrect exposures when shooting in such environments. And the last metering mode, I don't use it as often, but it's great for creating very abstract photos, and that's spot metering. In many cases, that will be tied to your focus point on some cameras, and it's basically a tiny little square that's getting metered. So if you place that square on the very bright thing, then it will just expose for that tiny bit and the whole image will go dark, and the other way around. This is great for getting those abstract, harsh highlight and shadow images that you've seen. That's what I use it for. But generally speaking, for most photography, I find it overkill and too sensitive. Let's put it that way. Editing, Roman here. You can also use highlight metering mode as well as spot metering. So many cameras like the Sony, the Leica, the Ricoh have highlight metering, and that would actually make this easier than using spot metering if you want to meter for the highlights specifically. If you're using a Fuji, as it stands today, I believe it doesn't have highlight metering, at least not the X100 that I have, so you have to use spot for this particular effect. As for general exposure values, when shooting on a normal sunny day, I will be somewhere between -0.3 and +0.3. If it's a very kind of open area, I might slightly overexpose. If it's a very contrasty area, I might slightly underexpose, or I just keep it at 0. But roughly somewhere there is fine, at least in my experience. Now, when shooting on a cloudy or overcast day, I would actually overexpose. +0.6, maybe +1 in some extreme cases, because cameras tend to underexpose cloudy days. The same applies for fog, mist, snow especially. So anytime you're shooting those scenes, overexpose, because you want the clean shadows, but it doesn't really matter if a tiny bit of the sky is blown out, because unless you want to capture every shade of grey on an overcast sky, then I don't know, I'd rather just have the skies blown out and have all the details preserved in the shadows. And last but not least is low light, and this is where I underexpose. So typically -1, give or take. Sometimes I can go further, sometimes it might be -0.6, but underexposing low light situations is a little bit counterintuitive, but it works, because if you set your camera to 0, you compare what's in the back of the screen to the reality, the back of the screen will be a little bit brighter. And also at night, you run the risk of blowing out your highlights, so your window lights, your lampposts, and any kind of bright areas of the image. So by underexposing, you're preserving the highlights, the shadows you can lift later, especially on some cameras like the Sony's, and you generally end up with a better photo than if you just expose at 0 and end up with blown highlights, which you can spot at night straight away. Alright, now let's talk about Aperture Priority, which is my most used photography mode. Before going into the aperture values, let's first discuss auto ISO and minimum shutter speed. The minimum ISO value I always set to whatever the lowest is on that camera, and the maximum I now set to 12,800. If I was making this video 3 years ago, I would tell you to not set it that high in order to avoid noise. However, these days, I think modern cameras are getting much better with high ISO noise, but even if using an older camera, software is becoming so good that cleaning up noise at 12,800 or beyond is actually pretty straightforward. In terms of minimum shutter speeds, I will set it to 1/250 for most photography, so during the day. 1/125 is what I would use at night, and if I need to ensure the motion is frozen, I can set it to 1/500 or 1/1000 even. Whatever you set it to doesn't really matter, because I don't know why, but on many cameras, that number isn't respected if the camera's pushed to the limit. So if you set it to 1/250 and you start to shoot in low light, the camera will boost the ISO up until it hits the limit. And then, rather than just giving you an underexposed photo, it would start to drop the shutter speed beyond the limit that you've set. That Fuji does that, Sony does that, I think Leica does that, many brands do that. I don't know why, but it's something that catches many people out. Now let's talk about aperture values, and the first group is f1.4 to f2. This group is used in low light scenarios, whenever I want the most difference between, let's say, what's in focus and what's out of focus, and if I want the softest possible image, because lenses tend to be softest when they are wide open. The second group that I would use, and this is where I spend most of my time, I think, is between f2.8 and f5.6. I think this is a very nice mid-ground where you get some background separation, but you also get enough in focus to not lose context. As a matter of fact, when I go out shooting, I set my camera to f4 as a starting point. The third group is f8 to f11, and this is what I would use for a lot of street photography, and also if I want as much in focus as possible. You know, if you're shooting at f11, anything from maybe like 2.5 meters up to infinity will be in focus. So it's a very kind of set it and forget it aperture value, especially if you're shooting in manual focus. Now let's talk about shutter speed priority, and even though, as I've said, aperture priority is what I use the most, I don't know, these days I find myself more and more in shutter priority. So let's break down shutter speeds that I would typically go to. 1/8 of a second is what I use for abstract photos and intentional camera movements. The second shutter speed is 1/20th to 1/30th. This is my typical kind of shutter drag, slow shutter speed mode. And this is great if I want to exaggerate motion. So if someone's running past, if a car's driving by, whatever's going on, it's slow enough to create motion, but it's not so slow that it will completely obliterate the whole image. So you still get context. 1/125th of a shutter speed of a second. This mode is what I use at night, low light situations. It's my starting point. I can go lower, I can go higher, but if I'm going out to shoot at night, I'll start at 1/125 and I go from there. The next shutter speed is 1/250. This is my go-to shutter speed for normal photography, day to day, cloudy, sunny. It doesn't really matter. That shutter speed works very well. If I want to ensure more things are frozen, 1/500. If I want to ensure everything is frozen, 1/1000. And if I'm shooting with a 200mm lens and there's something incredibly fast flying around or driving around, 1/2000 and above. Okay, exposure is now done. Let's move on to focusing. Focusing can be made out to be a very complicated topic, which I just don't think is true, because once you understand the basics and you have a little system, it's actually quite simple and the skills are transferable to any camera because all these cameras have the same basic features, right? So let's start with focus types. You have AFS, which is single, AFC, which is continuous. AFS, single autofocus, is, as the name suggests, you half press, it locks, it's locked, and that's it. You can recompose, you can do whatever. It's not going to change for any differences in distance. Continuous autofocus changes for those distances. So whatever the focus point is on, it will monitor it. So if you get closer or that thing, whatever you're focusing on, gets further away, you will track that focus. Okay. So where would you use each one? For me, single autofocus is what I use for still life. So architecture, I don't know, a coffee on the table, landscapes, cityscapes is great for that. Continuous is what I would use for street photography. If I am moving, if my subjects are moving, if I'm in a car, if I'm taking photos, if I don't know what I'm taking photos of, I'm just going through this busy market, there's loads going on, I want to take a photo of everything. That's where continuous for me comes in. Now let's look at autofocus types, and there are two. You have a spot and you have a zone. So Fuji calls it zone, I think Sony calls it flexi spot, other brands call it something else, but effectively it's a collection of small focus points. The single point I would use if I want accuracy and if my subject isn't moving too much, and the zone is what I would use if I want speed and accuracy isn't as important. As an example, you're running for a market, not literally running, but you're walking for a market, you're shooting, there's so much going on, you're always, looking at different things. That's where zone, at least for me, comes in useful. So now let's put all of this together, and if I want the most precise autofocus mode, I would use AFS with one focus point, with a spot focusing. This gives me the most accurate and reliable system if I want to make sure that whatever I'm focusing on is 100% in focus, and that precision is important to me. If I want speed, I would use the zone or the flexi spot along with continuous autofocus. That's going to be much quicker. That will result in more consistent results, but you might have an issue where what you wanted to focus on is 95% in focus and not 100. Okay, that is all for this video. I hope you found it useful. Please share your comments down below. Maybe you shoot in a different way. Maybe you think how I do it isn't good. If so, please leave your constructive feedback below, because I'll be curious to learn from you as well. Maybe you have a better way of doing it. So yeah, I'll be very curious. Other than that, that's it. So thank you so much for watching. Hope you have found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Sorry, one more thing I forgot to say is next week I'll be filming a Q&A video. So if you have any questions for me regarding gear, traveling, photography, anything really, just use the comment section for that. It's been about 5 months since the last Q&A, and to my surprise, that video did really well in the sense that many of you found it very useful and entertaining. So it's also a great way to connect with you. So please write your questions down and I'll try to answer as many of them as I possibly can in, I don't know if it's going to be the next video, but it'll be in the next few videos. Yeah, thank you. Speak to you soon. Bye. At this point, I want to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've been a paying customer way before they supported the channel and have now been using their services for over 5 years. Squarespace is at the center of my online presence, and it's what drives my blog, portfolio, store, and newsletter. I appreciate the simplicity of managing everything from a single app because it saves me time and gives me peace of mind knowing that I can make changes or deal with issues from my phone. If you have a business, a side hustle, or simply want your own little corner of the internet to host your photography or build something big, Squarespace offers all the tools you need across all devices. If you want to learn more, get a free trial and then 10% off your first purchase, use the link in the description or enter code RomanFox at checkout. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring, and thank you for watching.